Now that we've seen that Node.js has the ability to help us build a web server, it's time to make that process easier with one of the most popular ways to do that, and in fact, one of the most popular packages on the NPM registry. It's time to talk about Express. For our first lecture, we'll talk about installing Express, which is very easy thanks to NPM, and how Express makes it easier to build a web server. So I'm back to an empty app.js file, and I also have a basic package.json file as created via npm init. But I haven't downloaded anything yet, so there are no dependencies. So first, let's install Express. Express is available on the NPM registry, and it's just a bunch of JavaScript code. So we can go to the command line and type npm install Express, and I'll use --save to put it as a dependency in my package.json because Express is just JavaScript wrapping the kind of code that we've already seen before. And so that means that it needs to be there if I'm going to use Express to run it properly. Express gives me, via the node module format, access to a bunch of JavaScript code that other people wrote. So let's install it, which really means just download these JavaScript files. And it goes ahead and grabs it from npm, the registry. And note that now, in my node modules folder, there's an Express folder. So I can go ahead and use Express in my app. To do that, I'll just use the require function. So I'll call my variable Express and require Express. Since it's installed in the node_modules folder, then the require function will know to go out and look there and grab it. And if I want to know exactly what I'm getting, I can actually go into the Express folder and look at the code. So the index.js file in the Express folder in node_modules, that's where require is going to look. Remember, if we have a whole folder of code, we put an index.js file in the folder, and then we can require that folder as opposed to an individual file. We saw that earlier. So what's being exported is actually the contents of express.js in the lib folder. So there's a lib folder under the Express folder, and there's an express.js file. And here it is. And it's using some various things, but what it's exporting, thus ultimately what's being exported from the Express folder, is create application. And create application is a function. But notice it's not a function constructor, it actually returns a value. So I need to call this function. And what it returns is a function. And again, it's not returning a function constructor, it's returning a function. So I need to call this, but what this gives back to me itself is a function. And because functions are first class, because functions are objects in JavaScript, the creators of Express chose to add properties and methods directly to that function. So you can add properties and methods to a function just like any other object, because a function is an object. So it has an init function, there's a request and response property that look to be wrapping the standard node request and response objects. It adds on an application, router, query, this thing called static, all coming from other code. So it's combining various code that's sitting in here and making it accessible to this function that's returned from create application. So that means in my app.js file, to actually get this, usually we call it app, I'll have to invoke the function that was returned from require. And now this will also be a function, but it's a function that has some properties and methods on it, because functions are objects in JavaScript. So now I can use this. This is a working Express app. And one of the first things I'll do is to find an application.js inside the lib folder inside Express. it adds a listen function. And see what it does? It just does what we did before. It calls the standard core node HTTP object and the create server method. We've already used that. But instead of doing that, we simply say app.listen and then give it a port. If you look at the Express documentation, they often use port 3000 in their examples, so we'll use that too. So now I'll have an HTTP server running, based though just on that node core. Notice Express isn't adding anything to the C++ side of the node core. Everything Express is doing are things that you could have coded yourself. It's just a lot of JavaScript code taking care of a lot of very common things in a really great way, which is why it's so popular. We're avoiding a lot of this kind of work that we would otherwise have to write ourselves. Now, this is actually a good opportunity to talk about what might happen when we deploy this to a server. I'm listening on port 3000 because I'm developing locally, but that's not the port I'd want to listen on necessarily when it's actually out in production. So this is a good chance just to show that we can use environment variables. Big word alert. Environment variables. These are global variables specific to the environment, in our case usually the server, that our code is living in. So different servers can have different variable settings, and you might have other ways to set these variables outside of your code. But we can access those values in code. So each server could have a specific value set, some setting, and we can read that value and respond. And that way, we don't have to change our code in order to change a setting. There might be a way for the server to set the environment variable, and even though our code responds to it, we're actually setting the variable outside of it. And this we end up doing a lot when we're dealing with Node being deployed to servers. So let's suppose on your local box you want to run and listen to port 3000. But on your testing server, it might be a different port, and on actual production, it's another. So we can use environment variables for this. So let's say I set a variable called port, and I can use process, which is provided by Node as a global object, essentially, .env, and then whatever environment variable I want to access. Now, it may be a standard one, and it may be one that's added as an extra on the server. So let's suppose that we'll have a port variable set on the server. And so I'll be able to access it through process.env, whatever the variable is. And then I can use a JavaScript trick to set a default value. So this means this variable port will be either equal to the environment variable, or if this doesn't exist, which it won't on my local box because I haven't set up this environment variable, it will be equal to 3000. So I can just use it. So again, it will be either there is an environment variable called port, and that's what it will be equal to, or if not, a 3000. So on my local box, it will be 3000 because I haven't created this environment variable in the command line or any other way. But on many servers, when you're deploying Node, you can set up environment variables. So on Node, you could set up a port variable, maybe 80, on production, and that's what the app will listen to when this code is run in production, because the environment variable will exist. This is very common to do this kind of way in Node. Now, what about responding to the URL, the way we did with those if statements originally? Well, Express comes with a much, much better way to deal with that. We'll say app, that is that function that came back from invoking Express, that came back from actually requiring it, and it has on it various methods that map to HTTP methods or verbs. Big word alert. An HTTP method, this specifies the type of action the request wishes to make. Now this exists inside the HTTP request itself. It's just a piece of data. You'll see get or post or delete and others. They're also called verbs. Now they don't actually do anything in themselves because it's just some text, a piece of data that is coming along for the ride as part of the HTTP request. However, it's up to the server then to do what is expected to be done with one of those HTTP methods. For example, when you're just getting data, like downloading something or just getting a web page, it's a GET request. But when you send the contents of a form, you click the submit button on a form, it's usually a POST that's being sent. Ultimately, it's really basically just an HTTP request with a bunch of data, and one says GET and one says POST, and the one that says POST might have some data inside the request to go along with it. But we want to then respond properly to each of these different kinds of HTTP methods. And Express built in a way to then map what you see as the verb in the HTTP request to a particular function that you want to run when that request comes in. So on my Express app, I have access then to methods that are of the same name but lowercase. For example, app.get. This will respond to an HTTP request where the method or verb is get, capital G-E-T. And it will also map then to a particular URL. So if I just say /, that will be essentially the home page, and I give it a callback function. So what this does is does something similar but more powerful to when we had our if statement looking at the URL. An HTTP request comes in, this is the URL, and it's a GET method, it's a GET verb in the HTTP request, then this function will fire. And it will give me a request and a response, just like we did before, but this will be an express request and response, which wraps up the standard HTTP node request and response and provides a bit more functionality to make things easier for us. It's interesting to note that we could also have a .post, for example, if an HTTP post was given with the exact same URL, and I could have both of these, and they would respond separately depending on the verb, that is the method, that's in the request. So you can actually have the same URL, and depending on if it's a GET or a POST or a DELETE, do something different. So let's give this a try. I'll do res.send, then I'll send some HTML. Let's do a full proper HTML document with a head and a body and an H1 that says hello world, like we did last time. Now notice that I'm not putting a content type of text/HTML or something like that. The express methods and the response object that wraps up the standard response object actually looks at what I'm sending and takes care of that for me to the best it can. So once again, I'm saving myself a bit of time by using Express. All right, so let's run this. Let's do nodemon app.js. It starts, and we'll go to localhost 3000. And there it is, and it's HTML. So Express did the exact same thing we did before, essentially matching the URL and sending content and adding a content type to the HTTP response header. But it did a lot for me, and so that made my life easier. So let's go ahead and try adding a piece of JSON data. It will also be a GET, and I'll say let's match /API. So that will match the URL, and I'll get a request and a response. And then the response wrapper that Express provides adds the idea of response.json. And what that does is essentially I can give it a JavaScript object, and it will convert it to a JSON string like we did before, but it will do it for me. The code is written inside that .json, and as well as adding the proper content type. So let's give it a first name, John, and notice this is object literal syntax, not JSON. I'm just giving it a JavaScript object, and NodeMon should have, I stopped, let's restart it there. It should help me to go to hello world and then /API, and there it is, a JSON string with the proper content type. So we can already see how Express is helping me structure my code more cleanly and take care of little things that I could forget or otherwise wouldn't want to have to do. But Express actually does a lot more than that. Let's see.